Every story on Datago 100 is like a conversation over a hot cup of coffee. Welcome. I present to you today a delightful new mystery, starring Agatha Christie's adored amateur detective, Miss Marple, who is always perceptive and incredibly sharp. After you settle in, let's work together to solve this endearing puzzle. Additionally, if you would like, please tell me where you're joining from in a brief comment. Finding out from where our small detective community is listening is always a pleasure. Now let's begin. The body in the bell tower and Miss Marple. The type of village Miss Marple had always found most instructive was St. Petrock. In a place where secrets were carefully hidden behind doilies and courteous smiles, gossip traveled faster than the vicar's bicycle, and lawns were mowed with merciless precision. A subtle scent of warm scones and freshly cut grass permeated the air. But as soon as her feet touched the cobblestone walkway, Miss Marple felt a faint tension, as though the village itself was holding its breath. She had been invited by her good friend Mrs. Weatherby, whose love for the church celebration was as limitless as her skill at subtly influencing others. "Jane," she had written, "you have to come. It would be a pleasure to meet you in the village." Never one to turn down a fate, particularly when it included the promise of well-buttered crumpets. Miss Marple had accepted with her customary quiet grace. She felt a strange sense of expectation now, standing in front of the old church, its bell tower rising sharply against the sky. Old villages had a certain charm, particularly those with storied pasts and historic towers. If you stood quietly enough, you could almost hear them whispering the stories they carried in their stones. The church hall was bustling with activity as they prepared for the celebration. Tables creaked with the weight of homemade chutney jars, elderflower cordials, and Victoria sponges, whose labels shook with the fervent calligraphy. People who were a little too focused on taking home the Best Preserves award moved with the unique vigor of the villagers. Miss Marple, carrying her knitting inconspicuously in her handbag, was drawn to a group of women whose whispered voices hinted at something more intriguing than marmalade. They talked half in fact and half in fantasy, as villagers frequently do. According to one, the tower is unlucky because it is tilting a floral hat too far to the left. Up there, terrible things are always happening. "Oh, you mean poor Stephen," who added another, lowering his voice. "All those years ago, but no one really paid attention. They claim to have fallen from the top or been pushed." Eyes darting to and fro for dramatic effect. Some whisper that it's cursed. There, bad luck clings like ivy. Miss Marple, who was more inclined to believe in human nature than in curses, remained silent. The organist and the vicar's wife were both trying very hard to pretend not to listen, but she filed the words away neatly along with their faint glances. Later that afternoon, the vicar himself led a brief tour up the bell tower in between the tombola and the sponge cake competition. Miss Marple joined in naturally, her curiosity far more vigorous than her knees, though her joints were not quite as supple as they once were. As anticipated, the air in the tower was heavy with centuries' worth of damp stone and old wood, making it gloomy and musty. Time and negligent parishioners had scratched the walls, and the stairs were narrow and uneven underfoot. Halfway up the first flight, Miss Marple stopped, her gaze drawn to something so tiny that it could have gone completely unnoticed. A stone, a little looser than its companions, with a corner stained by blood or rust. The faintest metallic scent, sharp and fleeting, was detected by her for a very brief moment. Miss Marple, who understood the importance of patience, made no fuss when the vicar's voice called them all upward before she could get a better look. The tower, whatever it was, had chosen to tell only a portion of its tale. Right now, at the time, they were almost at the belfry. At the back of the group, old Mr. Jessup, the groundskeeper, stumbled. Something wedged awkwardly beneath the last bend in the stairway had caught his foot. He muttered a curse, reached down, and became motionless. A pause occurred, that breathless silence that occurs when everyone in a room senses something awful at once. Then, slowly, Mr. Jessup retreated until the silhouette of a hand emerged from the windows below the stairs, its pale fingers curled inward. No scream or dramatic fainting was heard. This was, after all, St. Petrarch. Rather, a collective gasp was heard, followed by the low mutter, "Well, I never." The vicar muttered something about calling for the constable, looking as pale as his own vestments. But Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes shifted from the body to the faces surrounding her, focusing on the quick, calculated fear in one, the barely contained relief in another, and the flicker of recognition in one. The villagers reluctantly went back to their scones and raffles after the body was covered and the police were called, but the topic of conversation had clearly changed from who makes the best jam to who might be responsible. Like a lace tablecloth, polite horror draped the village, delicate, ornamental, and completely inadequate to conceal the darker thoughts underneath. Miss Marple sat quietly drinking her tea and watched everything. The vicar's wife was too quick to claim that she didn't know the poor man very well. The organist rearranged him sheets that didn't need to be rearranged, her fingers trembling a little. Weatherby, the widow, was unusually quiet and stared out the tower window. St. Petrock had done what English villagers do best, encasing a tragedy in bunting and serving it with cream tea, complete with flower shows and fundraising events. However, Miss Marple was well aware that murder rarely occurs without warning. It develops, nourished by silence and fed by secrets, until one day a hand emerges beneath the stairs. So she folded her hands over her knitting, sipped her tea, and waited. After all, the village was always willing to chat. She only needed to pay attention. Once out of the narrow staircase, the body lay beneath a hastily drawn sheet as the young, sincere constable tried to keep the peace. Identification happened much more quickly than Miss Marple might have thought. The name was Thomas Felbrigg, and the villagers instantly recognized it. By all accounts, he had been a man of little importance, neither especially endearing nor particularly problematic. However, there had been some conjecture following his abrupt disappearance months prior. Most people thought he had gone to London, the kind of person who disappears without saying goodbye or providing an explanation. And yet he had never left St. Petrock, and here he was, dead beneath the bell tower of the village. The vicar explained that Thomas had done various odd jobs for the church, and Miss Marple listened quietly. A little cleaning, a little painting, useful labor for a man with no obvious future. It appeared that there had been no departure at all during that silent departure. The village had just erased Thomas because they were so ready to forget annoying men like him. So far, reluctantly, the vicar's wife acknowledged that she was the last person to see Thomas alive. With her hands folded too tightly in her lap, she remarked that he appeared uneasy. The day before his disappearance, that is. He asked me to deliver a message to Mrs. Weatherby when he arrived at the vicarage. Despite her composure, her voice had the deliberate polish of someone who had repeated the story several times in her head. She recounted their exchange with an accuracy that seemed a bit too flawless, as if every word had been gleaming like silver before being put on exhibit. With a soft click of her needles, Miss Marple listened without comment, only observing the vicar's wife's one and only glance toward the window, as if anticipating someone would show up. Her words weren't nearly as powerful as that quick glance. Yes, a message for Mrs. Weatherby. But what kind of message would need to be handled with such care? And why hadn't anyone shared it? Mr. Jessup, the church groundskeeper, could not be said to have treated Thomas with the same tact that the vicar's wife had. There had been more than one argument between Thomas and Jessup, a man with hands like tree roots and a temper to match. Some whispered, a loan, given in good faith, never repaid. According to others, the argument went deeper, involving a night after hours when Thomas was spotted lurking close to the vestry door. Jessup snorted, a dismissive and defensive sound, when questioned about it. He wiped his hands on a once-white cloth and said sourly, "Man was a bad penny." With that cunning smile of his, he took advantage of every opportunity. However, Thomas no longer had a smile on his face, and as Jessup returned to his work, Miss Marple saw how his shoulders tensed, as if preparing for an unproven blow. Trouble was inevitable for a man like Jessup. Had he opened the door? Was the question. Of all the names associated with Thomas, none sparked more curiosity than Mrs. Weatherby, a young widow who was wealthy beyond what was strictly necessary and had a charisma that sparked conjecture. It was well known that Thomas had frequently been spotted at her garden gate, purportedly cutting hedges or delivering packages. Far richer stories, however, had been told by the village gossip mill. They told of whispered meetings in darkened rooms and of laughter that filtered through half-open windows a bit too softly. Mrs. Weatherby's response to the news of Thomas's passing was flawless. Eyes widened slightly, not theatrically, but enough to convey surprise, hand to throat. Miss Marple believed it was a practice performance. With just the right amount of sadness for a man she hardly knew, she said the right things in the right order. Nevertheless, Miss Marple observed how her fingers coiled tightly around her teacup's stem and how, when asked when she had last seen Thomas, she blinked too frequently. After all, poise is superficial. Miss Marple sat quietly knitting in her lap as the village buzzed with conjecture. The pattern was more automatic than deliberate, but her focus remained firmly on those around her. When Thomas's name was called, some people looked away too soon. Some talked excessively, providing information that no one had requested, as though occupying the silence would release them from responsibility. Then there were those who remained silent, their silence clinging to them like wet wool, burdened by everything they were afraid to say. Theories and accusations were unnecessary. Not just yet. Miss Marple knew that truths came slowly, like cream rising in a teapot, in villages like St. Petrock. Patience and the knowledge that there was a story no one wanted to share behind every courteous smile were all that was needed. Thus, Miss Marple folded her knitting and went to her room as the village began to darken. There was a lot to contemplate, and even more to covertly reveal. The police had roped off the tower, and the villagers of St. Petrock never needed much persuasion to hang around where rumors ran wild. So by the next afternoon the church hall had turned into a meeting spot for conjecture. At the front, a wiry man with a voice like rustling paper, the local historian, had been called upon by popular demand to narrate the distant history of the bell tower, which had never been completely scandal-free by village law. He talked about odd mishaps, mysterious falls, and voices heard after dark with delight. Each story was woven together over many generations until the telling and the truth were no longer separate. He asserted that each incident had left its mark, not always on the stone, but rather in the village's collective memory. With her hands in her lap and a courteously attentive expression, Miss Marple listened. Behind her kind eyes, however, her mind categorized each story into two tidy piles, the profitable and the believable. After all, the villagers cherished their hauntings. Any number of unpleasant facts could be concealed by a good curse. The tale of the vicar's son and the maid, a romance discussed in the circumspect tones reserved for family disgrace, was the most cherished and frequently recounted. She had been a pretty girl from a nearby village who was much too vivacious for the vicarage's taste. As the sole son, he was overburdened with expectations and had fallen madly in love. Away from the prying eyes of parishioners and parents, they had met in the bell tower. They had been spotted fighting at the top of the stairs one evening. When the sexton arrived on his way to ring for matins, he discovered her body lying broken at the base of the tower. Soon after, the vicar's son left the village, and his name was hardly ever mentioned again. A few people, who still lowered their voices when they passed the tower, claimed it was the tower itself, enacting a curse that had lain beneath its stones for centuries. Others claimed she was pushed, while still others said she jumped. The stories weren't all tragic. While tarnished by time and disappointment, some, such as the legend of the hidden treasure, had a brighter gleam. A small hoard was rumored to have been left beneath the tower's foundation when the village had taken in a runaway priest during the Reformation. He had died before disclosing the exact location where he had hidden the church's valuables beneath the floor. Many ambitious villagers have tried their luck with a spade and crowbar over the years in the hopes of finding glory and treasure. Miss Marple observed that this specific story was always told with a smile, the kind of tale that made village life more charming without the hassle of being true. However, she also pointed out that some names, those of families who had always seemed a bit too interested in church finances, appeared more frequently than others in the retelling. The historian's tale inevitably returned to the curse, an idea that had spread like ivy over each death, disappearance, and scandal associated with the tower. The villagers liked to say that those who broke sacred vows, whether they were financial or romantic, were haunted by bad luck. After all, blaming a curse was simpler than acknowledging jealousy, greed, or plain negligence. Several villagers crossed themselves as the historian was speaking, not because they truly believed it, as Miss Marple suspected, but rather because superstition was commonplace here and was passed down like family china and old recipes. Conveniently, The curse served to maintain the villagers' belief that only those who deserve bad things happen there. Later, Miss Marple sat by herself in the churchyard with her knitting on her lap as the villagers dispersed and the historian reveled in the aftermath of his performance. Curses, in her opinion, were a helpful invention, typically used by someone who had a very practical need for silence. In her experience, real crime was neither glamorous nor spectral. It was much more frequently about unpaid debts, broken promises, and unspoken fears. She could feel the fear now, mixed with the courteous banter and a little too loud denials she had heard all day. The tower's sinister reputation had been used by someone, somewhere, to conceal something much more dangerous and less supernatural. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and smoothed the wool between her fingers as the evening prayers bell tolled softly. The living were always the ones to keep an eye on, but ghosts were all right, she thought. Of course, this is the AI voiceover-ready script for Chapter 4, The Gentle Inquisition. It was written using the subheadings you supplied and adheres to the necessary storytelling, tone, and flow guidelines. The table had been carefully laid by the vicar's wife. A dish of clotted cream, delicate china, and homemade scones are arranged at the ideal angle to convey hospitality rather than luxury. As usual, the conversation veered toward the regrettable discovery in the bell tower, but Miss Marple smiled and took her tea, her fingers resting lightly on the saucer. Naturally, the vicar's wife expressed sympathy, but her words had the exact, practiced tone of someone who had practiced her role a bit too much. She sighed slightly and said, "It was such a shock. Thomas was always such a reserved individual. I fail to see why anyone would want to hurt him." But when Miss Marple softly asked when they had last spoken, her smile wavered. There was a little pause, an overly cautious word choice, and a look out the window as if the garden might have a better response. Even though it was only a brief hesitation, less than a heartbeat, Miss Marple saw it as the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Miss Marple had expected Mrs. Entwistle to be leaning over her garden gate, her eyes alight with the fierce joy of a woman in possession of scandal, her apron still dusted with flowers. She wasted no time in unraveling the intricate web of village rumors, saying, "Oh, Miss Marple, you wouldn't believe the things I've heard." It appeared that Thomas had a lot of debts, admirers, and enemies, but underneath the embroidery was something much more helpful, a time difference that was mentioned almost by chance. Eager to demonstrate her expertise, Mrs. Entwistle remembered seeing a particular villager close to the tower a long time after the villager had claimed to be in bed at home. Miss Marple simply nodded, her hands lightly folded over her purse, without saying anything to refute her. The most uncomfortable truths were frequently exposed by the smallest contradictions, those spoken casually in excitement. Miss Marple left Mrs. Entwistle's gate and walked slowly to the village green, where the chatter flowed like summer breezes, from death to recipes, from gardens and back again. Within earshot, but not directly to her, two villagers recounted their memories of the night. Thomas disappeared. Someone claimed to have seen him head down, hands in his pockets, making his way toward the vicarage. His posture was unusually upright, almost as if he was trying to be seen, and the other was positive he had gone the other way, toward the widow Weatherby's gate. Miss Marple didn't correct or comment, but she did observe how easily people rewrite facts to suit their preferred narratives as the discussion veered back to less lethal topics. She was aware that certainty rarely shaped the truth. Overlapping lies were used to piece it together. In the silence of the churchyard later that afternoon, Miss Marple met a rather anxious parish committee member who was anxious to seem helpful. Unprompted, he provided a chronology of events while maintaining that he had not seen anything. His story had one minor, nearly imperceptible flaw and was overly neat. With a gentle expression, Miss Marple allowed him to continue talking until he stumbled over his own story like a man who has tied his own shoelaces. There was a small detail that seemed out of place, just enough to imply that he was trying to subtly shift suspicion to someone else and knew more than he acknowledged. It wasn't a complete lie. It was half true, the kind of thing people say when they're scared of being too near the truth. Miss Marple returned to her chair in her tiny guest room, the evening light softening the edges of the furniture. As usual, her hands were busy knitting, and her mind was elsewhere, sorting conversational threads like she did wool threads. There had been more than enough in the day to upset the pattern. Quiet hesitations, half-truths, and the kind of over-explained innocence that only guilt really demands. Long experience had taught Miss Marple that a flat-out lie is too bold, too obvious, and too purposeful. However, a well-placed half-truth that eludes detection, subtly shifting reality to shift suspicion just a bit to the left or right. She put her knitting away, content that the village had already provided her with all the information she required. The rest just needed to be untangled. As is often the case, it started as a whisper that was hardly audible. At the flower-arranging table in the church, two women sat side by side, lowered their voices just enough to pique interest, and then looked over their shoulders to make sure they were noticed. They said that Thomas Felbrigg had not been quite the reclusive character the village had portrayed him as. The eyes of a respectable married woman, whose name neither of them dared to mention directly, flickered meaningfully toward the church door. It appeared that the vestry had served as more than just a location for flower vases and hymn books. Its lock had been turned from the inside at least once, and the implication hung in the air like the smell of stale lilies, even though no names were mentioned. Miss Marple simply leaned closer to admire a particularly well-shaped rose without saying anything. However, she was already putting the first pieces of something messy together on the inside, something concealed in the quiet corners behind Sunday best smiles and marriage vows. Miss Marple ended up in the small, neat chaos of the vicarage office later that day, ostensibly to assist with the accounts. She discovered the kind of irregularity that reveals a much more complex story than it initially seems in the ledgers that no one had bothered to look at too closely. On the surface, the £1 that went missing from the church restoration fund was a small amount. The date, however, was what Miss Marple was interested in. On the day that Thomas Felbrigg disappeared, the entry was made. In that line, the vicar's handwriting shook a little, as if his pen had faltered in the middle of a line. Although it might appear to be a clerical error to most, Miss Marple was aware that money was rarely lost in small towns. It was more frequently moved deliberately, particularly when a secret needed to be covered up. Without letting the vicar know that his neat columns had exposed something incredibly messy, she thanked him for his hospitality and gently closed the ledger. Mrs. Weatherby, who was always giving but never overly so, had donated a particularly large sum to the restoration fund at the next meeting of the church committee. Given the timing of the donation, it had caused more questions than it had answers. It happened a week after Thomas vanished, and Mrs. Weatherby changed as a result. Her usual radiance in widowhood had been replaced by a paler, more reserved, and slightly too eager appearance to be seen doing the right thing. Sitting quietly in the back, Miss Marple observed the widow's hands. Their fingers fluttered a little as they hovered just above the collection tin, then released the money as if it were burning. It was a gesture of a woman paying off more than a debt, perhaps a memory, maybe a fear, a donation intended to allay suspicions, Miss Marple thought. However, giving out of season only ever prompted more questions in towns like St. Petrock. Miss Marple requested to view the practice rota, kindly explaining that she needed to verify bell-ringing schedules for the federal, unaware that the names written next to each date were more interesting to her than the schedule itself. The vicar complied without question. Miss Marple had already heard the names standing there, defending their alibi a little too firmly against the day Thomas disappeared. The rota put them in the bell-ringing chamber without anyone to check if they stayed or left, despite their insistence that they were nowhere close to the tower that evening. It was a tiny crevice, just sufficiently narrow to allow suspicion to enter. However, Miss Marple had known all her life that the smallest discrepancies are what tear the entire tapestry apart. Miss Marple observed the villagers' smiles as they shared tea and biscuits in the village hall that afternoon. Mrs. Weatherby was present, but she was too quick to give the vicar's wife praise. In place of the committee member, whose smile wavered every time the word money was mentioned, there was the vicar, who grinned at his own sermon notes as if they contained secrets. Miss Marple noticed something more beneath each courteous smile. The quiet relief of those who think they've been smart enough to cover up their transgressions, little anxieties, and half-remembered lies. Miss Marple was never particularly interested in the noisy ones. They were the quiet ones, the ones whose hands only shook when they believed no one was watching. Miss Marple sat knitting that night with her window open to the refreshing village air. However, The pattern was formed more by memory than by attention, and her fingers moved almost unconsciously. Her thoughts were elsewhere, weaving together the threads of hushed affairs, lost weight, shattered alibis, and overly thin smiles, each one becoming increasingly intertwined until there was only one question left. Who stood to lose the most if Thomas Felbrigg had survived? Not who could have killed him. A secret that was old enough to be forgotten by most people, but remembered by the one person who would kill to keep it buried, was hidden somewhere beneath the lavender and lace of village life. Miss Marple permitted herself a silent grin, one of comprehension rather than victory. In her experience, small villages' courteous smiles frequently concealed the most sinister realities. It was almost midnight when Miss Marple reached for her cardigan, smoothed her skirt, and carefully set aside her knitting. She had decided on something. Sometimes the only solution was found in the quiet areas that people had ignored, and other times conversation alone was insufficient to solve a problem. A character in the story itself, the bell tower was frequently mentioned and was rife with rumors and superstitions. However, it appeared that nobody had paid much attention to what the tower had to say. Miss Marple had lived her entire life learning the language of silence. The way a well-polished surface can occasionally hide a stain, or how a door left slightly open reveals more than one that is locked. She was quietly certain that there was one last whisper in the tower, just waiting for someone who could hear it. Therefore, Miss Marple entered the night without any fanfare, announcement, or company. As an elderly woman who had lived long enough to know where truth prefers to hide, rather than as a detective on the hunt. At night, the tower looked different. By day, it was just history and ancient stone, a sight for tourists' cameras and children's curiosity. But after midnight, it changed completely, turning into a thing that moaned in the darkness and creaked under the weight of centuries made of iron and wood. Miss Marple ascended slowly but methodically, her hand moving lightly along the wall. Only the slightest whistling of wine through the tall windows broke the eerie silence. It seemed as though every step recalled its own history, including drunken confessions, lovers' trysts, and, on one occasion, a man carrying a body where no one would notice until it was much too late. The air grew colder as she arrived at the halfway landing, as if the stone itself had remembered fear. There was no fear in Miss Marple, who had never been a believer in such romantic ideas as ghosts. Just that odd feeling of silent expectation that always accompanies standing on the brink of comprehension. It was so small that it might have been overlooked for all time. At the top of the stairs, where the handrail turned sharply, a single frayed thread of fabric caught. As the brief light showed the color and texture of the cloth, not cotton, not wool, Miss Marple struck a match and shielded the flame with her hand. Something more elegant, something from a coat that people only wear on Sundays, and that they wear when they want to appear as though they have nothing to conceal. It goes without saying that the police had looked for the obvious in the tower. Miss Marple had known for a long time that the truth seldom comes out in a bold manner. More frequently, it hovers at the brink, tangled like a thread, awaiting someone with the right direction. Now that the evidence was tucked away, she descended slowly after carefully taking the fragment and folding it into her handkerchief, not only in her pocket, but also in the mental pattern she was creating. The alibi, which had been repeated so frequently that it had all but become fact, would still be accepted by the village by morning. With the assurance that only liars seem to possess, one villager had insisted that they had never been inside the tower, not on the night Thomas Felbrigg vanished, nor on any previous or subsequent nights. However, Miss Marple had evidence to the contrary in her pocket. Like a negligent fingerprint, a piece of their coat was ripped off and left behind. It was a minor lie, the kind that could be easily disregarded if it weren't for one awkward detail. Days before Thomas disappeared, the stair railing in the tower had been fixed. The fabric's presence could only indicate one thing, and it couldn't have lasted long. There was a breach in the alibi. Miss Marple realized that this was no typical deception because she had lived her entire life understanding the difference between small and large lies. People kill lies like this to keep them alive. Although Miss Marple's hands worked her knitting needles with quiet precision back at her lodging, her thoughts strayed far from the stitching pattern. Up until now, the vestry door, the missing pound, the fabric, and the anxious smiles have all been distinct threads. However, the web tightened with that one piece of cloth. Alibis were replaced rather than simply broken. Someone had meticulously planned out their story, much like they would have with a piece of embroidery. However, they were unaware that the entire design could be undone by a single loose thread. Finally, the bell tower had spoken, not in eerie voices or profanities, but in the plain language of recklessness, the kind of thing people do when they think no one is looking. Silently pleased, Miss Marple put down her knitting and folded her hands. Of course, there was still more to discover, but the truth was starting to take shape. According to her experience, the village's courteous silence would soon break down, and the true story would come to light after that shape materialized. The confession was made at the end of the village's evening meeting, which was held in the vicarage hall. It was unexpected, shaky, and just theatrical enough to make sense to people who were willing to believe it. Known for his devotion to order rather than his passion, Mr. Partridge, a member of the church committee, got up from his chair with his hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his tone veered between defiance and guilt, as if he were reciting a play intended for a much younger audience. "I did it," he said. "Thomas Felbrigg and I were involved. We had a disagreement. He made an unforgivable remark about my wife. I hit him. It was never supposed to occur." Some of the villagers looked at each other in shock, while others looked suspiciously relieved. The village liked nothing more than a clean ending wrapped in a noble cause, and a culprit had shown up. Miss Marple folded her hands, her face unreadable, her eyes focused on the faces of people around Mr. Partridge instead. In her experience, sincere confessions, the ones that were true, were rarely this easy. Miss Marple, who is usually mild, asked only the most courteous questions as the confession hung over the room. Where had the argument occurred? At what exact moment had the lethal blow been delivered? Mr. Partridge responded with sufficient ease, his narrative flowing with the polish of a man who had practiced every word. Yes, there was passion, but nothing was out of place or left unclear or messy. Miss Marple had witnessed enough genuine confessions to recognize right away what this one lacked: the unimaginable weight of unintentional violence, the stumbling hesitations, and the fragmented memory. Rather, this admission had been constructed for a viewership, designed to provide the village with the narrative it desired. She offered no challenge, whispered her sympathies, and nodded when appropriate. After all, doubt is most effective when it comes subtly and masquerades as impeccable manners. Miss Marple unfolded the piece of cloth she had discovered in the tower rail later that night in the seclusion of her room. She placed it next to Mr. Partridge's tale in her mind. He had described the timetable, the place, and the situation with such assurance. The two did not fit together, not in the same way that a lie fits a fear or a key fits a lock. The fabric had been caught high on the stairs, where Partridge, by his own admission, had never stepped, and it was clearly torn from a garment that had been worn by someone else entirely. It was a contradiction of the body, not the kind that can be attributed to memory loss or nerves. Simply put, it was not possible. Between her fingers, Miss Marple smoothed the cloth, feeling the quiet certainty that Mr. Partridge had confessed to something he could not have done, regardless of his motivations, in its rough edge. There were two main reasons why most people confessed to crimes they had not committed, as far as Miss Marple was aware. Either to keep something much older and more dangerous than the crime itself hidden, or to protect someone they loved. Mr. Partridge wasn't a man who was prone to romantic relationships or who harbored a special fondness for Thomas Felbrigg. Therefore, his confession must have served as a shield, held up to keep the village's attention away from something he was much more afraid of than the gallows. Miss Marple had dedicated her life to studying the effects of fear. Even the person who is lying can hardly recognize it for what it is because it distorts the truth, twists it around corners, and hides it beneath politeness. This was the fear of resurrected secrets, she suspected, rather than the fear of discovery. It's the kind of fear that belongs to something that was buried so long ago that no one remembers it ever existed. With the exception of the individual who has maintained it, of course. Miss Marple sat quietly knitting, letting the conversations of the evening rerun in her head. Not only the admission, but also the brief silences that ensued. A few villagers, all of whom were old enough to recall something the younger ones had forgotten, felt a certain tension. Miss Marple understood that Thomas Felbrigg's murder was not a crime unto itself. It was a result, the last in a series of events that had started years earlier when the bell tower witnessed another betrayal. One that had been covered by the silent, group consensus that some things were better kept unsaid rather than by confession. The knowledge that the village would be forced to remember what it had chosen to forget if the truth were revealed was what scared Mr. Partridge into claiming guilt for a murder he did not commit, not justice for Thomas. Miss Marple put down her knitting and gazed out her window at the quiet night. Time had started to shift the past, which had been so meticulously buried. And, as usual, whether the village was prepared or not, the truth would come to light. It was the most courteous invitation Miss Marple had ever sent out. It was suggested politely that the vicar, the church committee, and a few villagers could meet on the village green to discuss the sad circumstances of Thomas Felbrig's death. Arriving in twos and threes, the villagers' expressions were composed, a delicate blend of self-preservation and curiosity. In St. Petrock, after all, it was impossible to tell if a meeting was being called to reveal a lifetime of covert deceit or a simple misunderstanding. Miss Marple stood close to the old oak, her hands lightly folded over her purse, her demeanor feminine, and she had nothing urgent to say. However, it was unclear to whom her silence might cause discomfort. As usual, she started off politely, thanking everyone for their time, patience, and unwavering sense of community. "I do think we've all known the truth for a while, haven't we?" she added with the softest of smiles. "It was just a question of seeing it right." Miss Marple described everything in detail, not accusingly, but rather in the gentle manner of someone untangling a particularly challenging knitting pattern, with each stitch that was dropped inevitably leading to the next. She mentioned the Restoration Fund's missing pound, which was initially written off as a trivial mistake. Every one of the meticulously practiced alibis was a bit too polished. Villagers who knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be truthful, told half-truths. The fabric of courteous avoidance was woven with each lie as a thread. After all, nobody wanted to be the one to pull too hard for fear of the entire pattern coming apart. But Miss Marple had pulled gently until the whole thing fell apart in her hands, and she knew that the truth is never really lost, only tucked away like a misplaced handkerchief. And there it was, the outline of the truth, pieced together from the words and silences, as well as the questions that no one had the courage to ask in the first place. Miss Marple held up the piece of fabric she had discovered stuck in the stair rail of the bell tower with a quiet precision. She claimed to have compared it to every article of clothing in the community, examined seams, fabrics, and patterns with the attention to detail of a woman who is knowledgeable about both human nature and clothing. The sole match was a Sunday coat that belonged to the church treasurer, Mr. Soames. Naturally, if it weren't for the missing pound in the church records, which was noted on the day Thomas Felbrig vanished, that would have been strange enough. According to Miss Marple, a single missing pound was never really about the money. It was about the silent warning it symbolized, a debt of knowledge, not money, between two men. The money, the fabric, and the fear are all pieces of the same fabric that have been sewn together with deceit and despair. Although Miss Marple's tone remained soft, her words carried a weight that was unmistakable. She claimed that Thomas Felbrig had discovered a secret. This crime is not new. Rather, it has long been hidden behind courteous smiles and meticulously maintained accounts. Money had discreetly disappeared from the Restoration Fund years prior, moving into private pockets with the hope that no one would notice. However, Thomas, who was never particularly liked or trusted, had noticed and saw an opening. There would be a cost if he kept the secret. Nothing too big, just a little money here, a favor there. Until, of course, the burden became too great and the target of the blackmail realized that there was only one surefire way to permanently silence him. Miss Marple said quietly that while fear is a powerful emotion, it is much more dangerous when combined with pride. Reputation was more valuable than money, more valuable than truth, and, in extreme cases, more valuable than a man's life in a village like St. Petrock. The village appeared to stop breathing when Miss Marple finally said the name. Mr. Soames stood blinking in the sunlight like a man suddenly awakened from a dream, so trustworthy, so trusted with the church keys and the FET's cash box. His fingers shook with the cold certainty that he had finally been seen clearly, not with anger or denial. His tale was one of silent greed followed by years of frightened upkeep, rather than one of sudden violence or passion overtaken. Every falsehood had been told to defend the one before it until there were so many that murder was the only option. The fact that a man they had trusted had spent so many years smiling and serving tea while discreetly making sure no one ever looked too closely at the books was more terrible than the fact that a man had been killed. Some of the villagers were upset, while others were just confused. Miss Marple left without a word. After the village was given the truth, she never did. She could feel the weight of the silence behind her as she made her way to the lane. The silence of people who had always known but had never wanted to see. Naturally, they would get better. St. Petrock and similar villages always did. New flowers would bloom, new scandals would eclipse the old, and new committees would take up the task of maintaining tradition. However, Miss Marple was aware that some things would persist. Since it had never been the bell tower's curse that they should have feared, they would always think of Thomas Felbrigg and the cost of courteous silence whenever the bells rang. As usual, it was the silent concessions, the unwritten contracts, and the smirking dishonesty they had all decided to call respectability. Satisfied with her job, Miss Marple continued on, leaving St. Petrock to its morning tea and memory. Life in St. Petrock returned to its courteous, comforting rhythm as it always did. The flower show committee convened as scheduled, debating dahlias with the same intensity they had once used to discuss murderous rumors. As if no one had ever slept under the bell tower stairs, the church went back to its routine preparations. Easily, the conversation about who had the best gooseberries instead of who had concealed a lifetime of dishonesty behind a Sunday smile returned to the topic of gossip over hedges and garden walls. It appeared that murder had been reduced to a story, a tea-time tale that was mellowed with each repetition until it was almost endearing. Miss Marple knew that was how villages operated. Like secrets, death could be absorbed into the soil. Both eventually blended into the landscape itself, recognized but never quite expressed out loud. The village forgot as the gates clicked and the curtains shook, because villages excelled at that more than anything else. With her teacup on its saucer at her window, Miss Marple gave herself permission to think quietly for a moment. After all these years, murder itself was not what captivated her. Murder, as disagreeable as it was, had never been the illness but the symptom. She found it fascinating how well human nature could pass for one another, how greed and fear could masquerade as civility, and how cruelty could so easily pass for good manners. The inhabitants of St. Petrock had not been particularly evil. There was never a village. Simply put, they had been rehearsed to act as though nothing had happened and to convince themselves that a lie that was told for the right reason wasn't actually a lie. With her spoon creating a soft circle in the cup, akin to the ripples created by a single stone dropped into a still pond, Miss Marple added a little more milk to her tea. She believed that the best preservative of all was fear. Nevertheless, the truth, the complete truth, had existed from the start. Miss Marple recalled the celebration, the bell tower tour, and the occasion when her fingers grazed a loose stone that had hardly moved from its spot. It had seemed like a small flaw at the time, nothing to talk about. Later, much later, however, she remembered the faint metallic smell that pervaded the air around that stone. Even when blood is removed, traces remain. The truth had always been straightforward, realistic, and there, despite the village having talked itself into curses and ghosts. Anyone could have seen it if they'd really wanted to. However, seeing is a decision, and some decisions were never made in St. Petrock. People only remember what they can stand to remember, as Miss Marple had long since discovered. Naturally, the villagers would forget. It was already taking place. They would conceal the uncomfortable parts of the truth by encasing them in layers of vague rumors, turning them into innocuous folklore. In years to come, they would talk about the treasure under the stones, about the forbidden lovers, and about the body in the tower, as if it had never happened. The truth had too many honorable names and was too messy. Furthermore, reputation was always more important than reality in communities like St. Petrock. Miss Marple was not particularly resentful of this. She was too accustomed to it to be shocked. After all, the urge to forget was as instinctive as the urge to breathe. However, the bell tower itself was unique. After all, stone remembers. It recalls bodies being carried up and down its narrow stairs, footsteps, confessions, and arguments that ended in silence. It recalls the precise weight of guilt bearing down on the old wood, the silence of secrets whispered into the darkness, and hands gripping railings too tightly. The tower stood in its customary quiet as the sun descended over St. Petrock, unremarkable to anyone who happened to walk by. Miss Marple, however, was wiser. It stood as a witness, the kind that sees everything, says nothing, and outlives every single secret, rather than just as stone. New villagers would eventually arrive. They would listen to the tales and possibly find them entertaining. However, the tower would be able to distinguish between fact and fiction. It did every time. Miss Marple went back to knitting, her hands as steady as ever, her needles clicking softly. As they must, the villagers would forget. Miss Marple, however, refused. She carried the truth in the same way that a seamstress carries a tried-and-true pattern, knowing that it could be used at any time, but never pressuring people who didn't want to wear it. Rather than pride or victory, there was solace in knowing. Just comfort. The kind that results from realizing that there are secrets in every home, village, and human heart. Ultimately, there's no need to search for them. As long as one is silent enough to notice, they always show themselves. As the sun began to set over St. Petrock, Miss Marple poured herself a last cup of tea, already thinking about her next observation, her next pattern, and the next story that was patiently waiting to be revealed. This is because Miss Marple was certain of this, if there was anything. The truth is always there. Not at all. Tucked in between the stitches, it just waits. Of course, modeled after Miss Marple. This is a really interesting, audience-focused, and well-written conclusion to the body in the bell tower story you just finished. Made precisely to your specifications. Every face can be hidden, and every village has secrets. Perhaps the true mystery, however, is not who did the crime, but rather why so many people opted for silence rather than speaking the truth. There were no ghosts or old curses haunting the bell tower in St. Petrock. Something much more familiar haunted it. The silent fear of being recognized for our true selves. This has always been clear to Miss Marple. What people do in the dark isn't the real danger in small towns where everyone knows one another. They act as though it never occurred. Nevertheless, one person always finds the loose thread and patiently, gently tugs until the entire tapestry comes undone, in spite of the lies, the fear, and the cover-ups that are whispered. It raises the question of how many secrets lie just beneath the surface in your own circle or community. To make life more comfortable, how many stories have been kindly rewritten? If you discovered a dangerous secret in a village like St. Petrock, would you reveal it at all costs? Or would you keep quiet to preserve the well-preserved reputations of your neighbors? I would love to know what you think. Let's see how many of you would have the courage to tell the truth by reading your response in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one if you liked this one and appreciate the understated genius of classic mysteries. Remember to tell your other mystery fans about this video. These kinds of stories are always better when shared with others. After all, I appreciate you coming along on this exploration of St. Petrock's mysteries. Keep your eyes open and never undervalue what is hidden behind courteous smiles until the next time.